lesson, we're going to look at the basics of ecosystems, what their components are, and then we'll talk about how they function. So we have to start out at the very basics before we get up to ecosystem, which is a bit higher up in our levels of life. We start out with individual organisms, which are made up of genes and DNA and chromosomes, and then which are within the nucleus. They're made up of cells, which is where we get up to our organism level. From there, we start looking at the study of ecology, and we start going from the organism, and now we're going down the list here as we get larger in size. We have our organisms and groups of similar organisms together, same organism together make up a population, multiple populations together make up a community. An ecosystem is a combination of communities, or those interactions between the communities. And then the biosphere is all of what encompasses life on our planet. So we're going to start mostly this semester, and we're going to focus on ecology, and then we'll start to bring in the other components and the human interactions. So this graphic is just showing you through that progression through from atoms all the way up to our biosphere. And if you need to, you can pause the video here so that you can get your notes filled in. So we have our major life support components, and we talked about these a little bit in the first lesson. We have the atmosphere, which is all of the blanket of air that surrounds our planet. All of our life actually exists within a very small part of our atmosphere that's the closest down to the ground. We all exist within about 1.5 to 2 miles of the surface of the planet is where all life occurs. It's actually where all weather occurs also. So the layer of our atmosphere that's really close down to the Earth is the most important. We have the hydrosphere, which is all the water on our planet. This includes our fresh water and our salt water, and that water that's tied up in the ice caps. Our geosphere is the land portion. So now we're looking down here from the soil all the way down to that center of the core of our planet. We'll talk about in this course about how that top layer of the geosphere is very important when we talk about supporting our ecosystems and having that rich soil and that ability to grow plant life. And then the biosphere, once again, which is all the living components of our planet. When we talk about the biosphere, which is what we're going to spend a lot of time on this semester, we have two major types of life zones. We have our biomes, which is our terrestrial life zones, or those things that are based off of land. And then we have our aquatic life zones, which is our water life zones. So we're going to focus in the beginning parts of this lesson, we're going to focus on biomes, and later on we'll come back to the aquatic life zones. These are our biomes of the United States. We have pretty much all the biomes that exist on the planet exist in the United States. And interestingly enough, there's quite a few of our biomes that actually exist in Arizona, some that you wouldn't necessarily think about. We think about Arizona being mostly a desert, but we also have, as you go from Phoenix up towards Flagstaff, you're going to go through the scrub forest, you're going to go through the chaparral area, you're going to go, obviously we start out in the desert, you're going to go through some areas where there's grasslands, where there's short grass areas. You're going to go through, especially if you went the way through Sedona, you would go through deciduous forests where the forests lose their leaves, so where the oak and the aspen live. You would end up near Flagstaff, you would end up in the ponderosa pine forest, which is a coniferous forest. Coniferous just means that it has a cone, it's a cone-bearing tree. And if you were to go up on the San Francisco peaks, you would actually end up in tundra. So it's kind of cool. We have lots of different life zones here in Arizona that people don't necessarily think about. But they're also distributed across the United States. If you've taken earth science at all, you'll remember a little bit about those factors that affect climate, where we would expect to find wetter regions, where we would expect to find drier regions. In the wetter regions, we expect to find lush and taller vegetation, and in the drier regions and in the higher regions, we tend to expect to find shorter vegetation or no vegetation. You're going to be doing a few activities in this lesson based on biomes, so we'll come back to this one. So what do we need to actually sustain life on our planet? One, we need sunshine. It's the basis of all our food chains, right? Because our producers are what produce plant material on our planet, which is the basis of our food chains, because the herbivores eat the producers, and then our carnivores eat our herbivores. We are also dependent on the cycling of matter and nutrients, and there will be a section that is all about nutrient cycling, and we'll talk about why that's important. And then gravity. Without gravity on our planet, we wouldn't have the cycling of matter or nutrients. So it's very important. When we talk about the amount of sun that's reaching the Earth, so we're going to talk about the greenhouse effect. There is a natural greenhouse effect, and there's what's called an anthropogenic, or the human-induced or human-enhanced greenhouse effect. Both exist. The natural greenhouse effect is very important. Without the natural greenhouse effect, we would not have life on our planet. The blanket of gases that are in our atmosphere trap solar radiation close to the surface of the planet, which warms the surface of our planet. And it's what allows for life. So it's really important that it's there. If we didn't have that blanket of gases, if we didn't have that natural greenhouse effect, then we would have areas towards the equator that were really, really hot and areas towards the poles that were really, really cold. And we wouldn't have a very temperate climate across our planet, and we wouldn't have a lot of life on our planet. So it's really important. So we're going to look at a picture here, and I'm going to talk about the things that are on the slide with the picture. So here's our solar capital. So what comes from the sun, it can do a few things. It can get trapped in our upper atmosphere up here, and it can be absorbed by the upper atmosphere, and it heats the upper atmosphere. It can bounce off the upper atmosphere and get reflected back out in space and go back out from whence it came. It can pass through our atmosphere and come to the planet. And when it comes to our planet, once again, several things can happen. It can be absorbed into the surface of the planet, particularly if it's an area that's dark in color. So if we have forests or we have oceans areas, those areas tend to absorb solar radiation that comes in, and it heats. And then it's going to heat the air that's right above it, and that's going to result in warming on the planet. It can be reflected back out into space. So if it hits an area where there's lots of ice, or areas where there's lighter colors, like sand and things like that, it can reflect sunlight back out into space. And then once it hits the atmosphere, once again, it can either be reflected back down to the planet and kind of ping pong ball around, or it can go back out into space. So when we have that energy that is reflected back off of the surface of the planet, and it gets trapped up in the atmosphere, this is the greenhouse effect, because that trapping is happening because of the gases that are in the atmosphere. Those gases started out there originally naturally, outgassing from volcanoes, particularly sea spray puts things up into the atmosphere, animals defecating and releasing methane puts some of these gases up into the atmosphere. Totally natural process. But there is also the human-induced effect, which is where we've added greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which has increased the amount of heating. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the second semester when we talk about climate change and things like that. But just so you know that there are two different causes to the greenhouse effect, and one of them is completely natural and completely necessary to life on our planet. So we look at our components of an ecosystem. We have our life support systems, right? We have our sun coming in, we've got our nutrients that are cycling, and we've got gravity, which is keeping everything all together. And in our ecosystems, we have living components that are interacting with that stuff as well, because those are all abiotic factors. The water, the air, the carbon, the sulfur, the nitrogen, and all that stuff that's cycling around in the solar energy, that's all abiotic or non-living. The prefix A on the word biotic means against or opposed. So it's against life, it's not living or non. And the bio part meaning life. So the non-living parts are abiotic. And then we have all these biotic parts that are interacting with our ecosystem. And it's that interaction between the two that creates an ecosystem. And that's the difference between just talking about vegetation and plants and talking about a system, which is all the things work interacting together and seeing how they combine to make forests or grasslands or things like that. So in here, as we look at our picture in here, we've got our solar radiation, so our abiotic factor, the sun coming in. The plant is absorbing that solar radiation and it's photosynthesizing. And as it photosynthesizes, it's pulling in carbon dioxide and it's putting out oxygen. Both of those abiotic factors that are moving through this biotic factor of the plant, which is a producer. Now, the grass is also a producer, okay, and that's also going through the same processes as the tree is. Now, the bunny, happy little bunny here, well, not so happy, I guess, but our bunny is eating grass, so it's consuming, so it's a primary consumer. And sadly, our bunny doesn't seem to be paying very close attention because this fox, who is a secondary consumer or a first level predator, is going to come in and eat our bunny. Now, what's left of the bunny over here on the side decomposes into the ground. And as, once again, nutrient cycling is occurring, there are decomposers, which could be bacteria, could be things like mushrooms, could be lots of our insects are decomposers. They break down dead and dying material and put it back down into the soil, which becomes nutrients and then can be uptake back through the plants again. Our decomposers are super important because if they weren't around, then we would, everything that was dead would just stay on the ground if we didn't have decomposers, because they're what causes the breakdown of those materials and putting and cycling things back into. So if you think back to your younger days about the Lion King and the circle of life and everything, the circle of life isn't just predator-prey. The cycle of life is predator-prey, decomposer, sunlight, precipitation, all these factors acting in together. So if there's a small amount of an abiotic factor that's available, we call it a limiting factor. So a limiting factor is anything that's going to stop a population from growing because it doesn't have enough of it. So if it doesn't have enough water, that's going to limit the population. So not as much grass can grow because there's not as much water, right? It's going to limit that population. So we talked a little bit in a previous lesson about the range of tolerance with pH. We said that there's certain conditions, there's only a certain pH level that certain organisms can live within. And it's more than just pH. There are conditions just in general. What temperature of the water, how cloudy is the water, how much, if it's a terrestrial plant, like how much water is available, how much nitrogen is available to that plant, how much sunlight does it get, how much space does it have. All these things are limiting factors that can stop a population from growing. And if the environment changes and we have less of that particular limiting factor, then you're going to see a die-off. Or if you have a population that, for whatever year, let's say it was a really rainy year, and so there was a lot more grass that grew, so you had a lot more bunnies that were born that year because the parents had a lot more food. But then you go back to a regular year where you don't have quite as much rain, so you don't have as much grass, and now your bunny population is going to decline because you don't have as much grass for them to eat. So that's when you're exceeding that range of tolerance. When you go outside of the, I don't have enough grass anymore for my bunnies to eat, they're going to die off. So I talked about a few of these already, but soil nutrients, primary, we're looking at things like nitrogen, like phosphorus in the soil in particular. When you talk about aquatics, aquatic areas, dissolved oxygen is a big deal. If you have a fish tank at home and you've got a bubbler that's in your fish tank, you're actually putting dissolved oxygen back into the fish tank. If you weren't doing that, then the fish in your tank would use up that dissolved oxygen really quickly, and it would very quickly become a limiting factor. Salinity is not just about salt. Salinity is the amount of dissolved solids that are within the water. And some of those are things like what we think of commonly as table salt or NaCl. But there's also other things that are in there. We have calcium carbonate that can be dissolved into water. We have other kinds of solids that are in there as well. And so those are also limiting factors. Now, salt is a particular limiting factor, especially when we talk about plants. And in the second semester, when we talk about food production, the limiting factor of salinity becomes a big deal. So here's our range of tolerance. This is the range of tolerance is just that area where the organisms can live. So This middle part of the range of tolerance is the optimal range, so like their happy zone. So that's where all the fish are really happy because it's the right temperature, and this could be the amount of solids in the water, it could be the turbidity of the water, it could be lots of different things. But in this example, we're looking at temperature. So this is where it's just right. Think about Goldilocks and the Three Little Bears, where the porridge was just right and the bed was just right. Okay, that's what this optimal range is. As you get outside of the optimal range and you get into that zone of physiological stress, you have organisms that'll live there, but they don't look quite right. If you've ever had in your fish tank, like it was time to change the water and the fish kind of looked a little bit bent sideways or something like that, they're living in a zone of physiological stress because they don't have enough of what they need. They might still be reproducing, but the young might be deformed or have birth defects or something like that because the conditions weren't quite right. You're also going to have far fewer organisms that are within that zone of physiological stress. And if you pass that and you get outside of the range of tolerance, that's where you're in the zone of intolerance, and that's where mortality will occur. So if they go out into those areas, then they won't be able to exist there. If the water is too hot, the water is too cold, they're going to stay away from those areas. But if all the water changed into that temperature, then you would have a die-off. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about where organisms can live and what kind of conditions that they have to live in. We talked about the biotic factors and the abiotic factors that can surround them within the ecosystem components. When we start looking at the actual organisms that are within the ecosystem, which is what's in this chart, we talk about trophic levels, and that's our next topic, are the trophic levels. And we're going to look at our different critters and our plant material, and we'll talk about the trophic levels of those. So a trophic level is a feeding level. So our producers are considered autotrophs. Auto meaning self, troph referring to feeder. So they are self-feeders because they're photosynthesizing. They're the only organisms in our food chains that make their own food on a cellular level. Not like I go into the kitchen and I make myself some dinner, okay, because I'm making food, right? But I'm not making it at the cellular level. I still had to get food that something else made, okay, at the cellular level. So plants are all we're talking about there with the producers. Consumers are called heterotrophs or other feeders because they have to feed on something else that made its own food. So we have our primary consumers, which are our herbivores, and they eat only autotrophs. Our carnivores will eat our herbivores. We have our omnivores, which will eat our herbivores and our carnivores, and that's a third level, right? So sometimes carnivores can be big animals, especially our third level or tertiary level consumers. You think about things like big cats, right? Like lions and tigers and that kind of stuff. But I also want you to think about birds. So, because a lot of our birds are at least second level consumers, if not third level consumers, especially if they eat plants, like they eat seeds and things like that, and they eat bugs or they eat worms or something like that. Now they're they can be considered omnivores. And then if it's a bird of prey, now they're a third level consumer, because if they eat sparrows and doves and things like that, they're a third level consumer because those are carnivores as well. So not necessarily always great big animals. So we have our omnivores that eat both, and then we have our decomposers and our detrivores, and they're kind of outside. They're like not part of that first, second, third level consumer thing. So our decomposers are only eating dead things, and a lot of times these are bacteria, fungi, insects, that kind of stuff. And then we have our detrivores. So my favorite detrivore has got to be from Ice Age. So I want you to imagine, if you've seen Ice Age, where all the little critters they're escaping, right? The incoming ice, and there's the little dung beetle who's like rolling the little thing of dung, and he says, "We have to bring this crap. Isn't there going to be crap where we're going?" Okay, they're a detrivore. They're rolling that along because that's what they eat, is the dung, and they keep it there. So detrivores are things like dung beetles. Here's a picture of some of our detritus feeders, or our detrivores, and our decomposers that are breaking things down over time. Once again, these are super important because they are the recyclers in nature, and so they're the ones that are making sure that all of our dead material decomposes and breaks down over time and goes back in nutrient cycles again. So once again, we go back to what are our life support systems, right, on our planet, and one of those things is that nutrients are cycled. They're coming from, with the one-way energy flow from the sun, we need our nutrient cycling, right, that occurs, and it's occurring because we have gravity. So we have to have energy that comes because we have to have warm things rising, cold things sinking. In order for air to move, we need to have areas to be warmed up, and so that we have things like photosynthesis can occur, and we can have our warm-blooded critters can do their things and all of that. So energy flow is really important in ecosystems. Without the energy flow from the sun and without our nutrient recycling, we would not have ecosystems as we see them today. We would not have nutrients that are cycling through them, and we would not have this continuation of life in areas. So this is a little model of an ecosystem showing the parts that we were just talking about, having our abiotic factors and our biotic factors, and that energy, once again, energy flowing through our ecosystem, flowing through our consumers, flowing through both our plants and our animals. Okay, we're seeing our heat that's lost to that second law of thermodynamics, but we're also seeing our nutrients that are cycling through as well.